My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. I am 67 years old now, retired from a profession that occupied 4 decades of my life. From 1973 until 2015, I worked as a medical examiner, first at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, then later at the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office. Over those 42 years, I handled cases that ranged from the mundane to the extraordinary. I have stood over the bodies of celebrities whose deaths puzzled the public, traced the brutal signatures of serial killers through the wounds they left behind, documented the silent casualties of epidemics, and watched forensic science evolve from rudimentary techniques performed under flickering fluorescent lights to the precise digital methodologies of the modern age. I have seen the dead in every imaginable condition, and I have learned to read their stories through the language of tissue, bone, and decay. But there are some cases that resist explanation, some moments that defy the orderly logic of pathology, and it is one of those moments I wish to share with you tonight. The body arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, 1987. The air in Los Angeles carried that peculiar autumn coolness, dry and brittle, the kind that makes the city feel older than it is. The man on my table had been declared dead at the scene by paramedics. His name was Nathan Crowe. He was 43 years old. He had been wanted by law enforcement across 3 states for a series of murders that spanned nearly 6 years. 12 victims, all of them found in remote locations, their bodies arranged with a deliberate, almost ceremonial precision. Crowe had been cornered in a derelict motel room near the edge of the Mojave Desert. According to the reports, he had ingested a lethal dose of barbiturates and antifreeze before officers breached the door. By the time they reached him, he had no pulse, no respiration, no signs of life. He was cold to the touch. He was dead. At least, that is what everyone believed when they brought him to me. I would like you to take a moment now. If you are listening to this in the quiet hours, perhaps late at night, perhaps alone, I ask that you settle into that solitude. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the world outside recede. What I am about to tell you is not a story designed to shock or entertain. It is a memory, one that has lived in the back of my mind for more than 3 decades, waiting patiently for the right moment to be spoken aloud. It is a memory that still troubles me, not because I cannot explain it, but because the explanation I have come to accept sits uncomfortably against everything I was trained to believe. I have spent my life in the company of the dead. I have learned their silence, their stillness, their absolute absence. But there are moments, rare and inexplicable, when that absence feels less certain, when the boundary between what we know and what we fear becomes thin enough to see through. Before we begin, if you find comfort in these late-night accounts from my years inside the morgue, you may want to stay close. More stories like this one tend to surface when you least expect them, and I hate for you to miss what comes next. So, if you wish to keep following these quiet journeys through the shadows of history, feel free to subscribe. And if this kind of story resonates with you, a simple like helps more than you know. Now, let's proceed. The body of Nathan Crowe arrived at the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office at approximately 9:15 in the morning. I remember the time because I had just finished my first cup of coffee, a ritual I maintained throughout my career. The morning briefing had been unremarkable. A traffic fatality on the 101. A suspected overdose in Echo Park. A drowning in a private pool in the hills. Nothing unusual. But then the call came through from the deputy coroner. They were bringing in the body of a fugitive, a serial killer who had taken his own life during an arrest. The case had been all over the news for weeks. Nathan Crowe, the desert architect, as the press had taken to calling him. The name came from the way he arranged his victims, positioning their bodies in the sand with their limbs extended at specific angles, their faces turned toward the sky, as if offering them up to something vast and indifferent. The media loved the theatrics of it. I did not. I have never appreciated the way the press turns murder into mythology. When they wheeled him in, I was struck first by how ordinary he looked. In photographs, Crowe had appeared gaunt and feral, his eyes hollow and distant. But here, on the gurney, covered by a pale green sheet, he looked like any other middle-aged man who had died suddenly. His face was slack, his skin waxy and cool. His hair, dark and thinning, was plastered to his forehead with dried sweat. His hands, visible at his sides, were rough and calloused, the nails chewed down to the quick. There was nothing monstrous about him. Nothing that would have marked him as a man who had taken 12 lives and discarded them in the desert like broken furniture. That is one of the quiet horrors of my work. Evil does not announce itself. It wears the same skin as everyone else. I began the external examination as I always did, methodically and without haste. I noted the absence of rigor mortis, which was consistent with the time of death reported by the paramedics. His body had been found approximately 4 hours earlier. I documented the ligature marks on his wrists, evidence of a brief struggle with the arresting officers before he collapsed. I noted the faint chemical odor that clung to his clothing, the acrid tang of antifreeze mixed with something sweeter, likely the barbiturates. His eyes were half open, the lids drooping but not fully closed, the irises a pale gray-blue, clouded and fixed. I checked his pupils. No reaction to light. I pressed my fingers against his carotid artery. No pulse. I listened to his chest with my stethoscope. No heartbeat, no breath sounds. By every measure I had been trained to trust, Nathan Crowe was dead. I began the internal examination just after 10 o'clock. My assistant that day was a young man named Eric, a recent graduate from the Pathology program at USC. He was eager, perhaps too eager, and I often had to remind him to slow down, to observe rather than rush. We worked in silence for the most part, the only sounds the hum of the ventilation system and the soft clink of instruments on the steel tray. I made the Y incision with care, drawing the scalpel from each shoulder down to the sternum, then continuing in a single line down to the pubic bone. The flesh parted cleanly. There was no blood. The absence of blood in a body is always unsettling, even after years of practice. It makes the corpse feel less like a person and more like an object, a hollow vessel that once held something vital and now holds only silence. I reflected the skin and soft tissue back, exposing the rib cage. Eric handed me the rib cutters without my asking, and I began the process of removing the interior chest plate. The sound of the cutter shearing through bone is one you never quite get used to. It is sharp and final, a severing that feels more absolute than any other cut. I removed the sternum and set it aside, revealing the thoracic cavity. The heart sat nestled between the lungs, small and still. The lungs themselves were mottled and dark, consistent with asphyxiation and chemical poisoning. I reached in and palpated the liver, noting its texture, the slight discoloration that suggested toxic overload. Everything I saw confirmed what the reports had told me. Nathan Crowe had poisoned himself. His organs were shutting down. His body was dead. But then I reached for the heart. I always remove the heart with a certain reverence. It is, after all, the engine of life, the organ that defines our existence in the most literal sense. I cut through the major vessels, the aorta, the vena cava, the pulmonary arteries, severing the connections that had once kept blood moving through this man's body. I lifted the heart free and held it in my gloved hands. It was cool, dense, slightly larger than average. I set it on the dissection board and prepared to make my first incision, to open the chambers and examine the muscle tissue, the valves, the coronary arteries. I placed the blade against the right atrium. I pressed down gently, beginning the cut, and that is when his eyes opened. I did not see it at first. I was looking down, focused on the heart in my hands, the scalpel moving in a slow, controlled arc. But Eric made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, almost a gasp. I glanced up at him. His face had gone pale. His eyes were wide, fixed on something behind me. I turned, following his gaze, and I saw Nathan Crowe staring directly at me. His eyes were open, fully open. The cloudiness was gone. The pupils were dilated, black and bottomless, and they were locked onto mine with an intensity that felt physical, like a weight pressing against my chest. His mouth moved. His lips parted. And then he spoke. He said my name. Not Dr. Webb. Not doctor. He said Marcus. He said Marcus Webb. And then, in the same flat, emotionless tone, he recited my home address. The house I had lived in for 8 years. The street, the number, the city, the zip code. Every syllable was precise, deliberate, unhurried. He did not blink. He did not breathe. His chest did not rise or fall. The incision I had made was still open, the sternum removed, the organs exposed. He should not have been able to speak. He should not have been able to see. He should not have been able to do anything at all. Eric dropped the instrument tray. The clatter of metal on tile was deafening in the silence that followed. I stood frozen, the heart still in my hands, the scalpel poised above it. Nathan Crowe's eyes remained fixed on me. His lips moved again, forming words I could not hear over the roaring in my ears. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. His eyes rolled back. His mouth went slack. The terrible awareness that had filled his gaze drained away, replaced once more by the empty, glassy stare of the dead. I set the heart down. My hands were shaking. I stepped back from the table. Eric was pressed against the wall, his face bloodless, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I looked at the body, at Nathan Crowe, at the man who should not have been able to speak, who should not have been able to know my name, who should not have been able to do anything but lie still and silent on my table. I have spent the decades since that morning trying to understand what happened. I have considered every rational explanation. Post-mortem reflex, residual neurological activity, some bizarre artifact of the poisoning, a final electrical storm in a dying brain. But none of those explanations account for what I heard. None of them explain how a dead man, a man with no heartbeat, no respiration, no brain function, could speak my full name and recite my address with perfect clarity. And none of them explain the look in his eyes, the recognition, the intent. I have seen death in every form it takes. I have seen bodies in states of decay so advanced they no longer resemble anything human. I have seen the victims of violence, of disease, of time, but I have never seen anything like what I saw in Nathan Crowe's eyes in that moment. It was not life. It was something else. Something that should not have been there at all. In the days that followed, I filed my report. I documented the findings of the autopsy. Cause of death, acute barbiturate and ethylene glycol poisoning. Manner of death, suicide. I did not mention what had happened during the examination. I did not tell anyone what Crowe had said, or that he had opened his eyes, or that he had spoken at all. Eric never spoke of it either. We had an unspoken agreement, a shared understanding that some things are better left unrecorded. But the silence did not bring me peace. It only deepened the questions. And as the years passed, as I continued my work, as I stood over body after body, I found myself returning to that morning, to that moment, to the sound of Nathan Crowe's voice speaking my name, because there was something in his tone that I have never been able to forget. It was not anger. It was not malice. It was something colder, something patient, as if he were simply acknowledging me, as if he were letting me know that he had seen me, and that, perhaps, he would see me again. Nathan Crowe's criminal history was as meticulous as it was disturbing. Before his death, or what we believe to be his death, he had been the subject of a multi-state manhunt that stretched across California, Nevada, and Arizona. His first known victim was discovered in 1981, though investigators suspected he had been active long before that. The victim was a 26-year-old woman named Laura Finch, a secretary from Riverside who had vanished while driving home from work one evening in late July. Her car was found abandoned on the side of Highway 62, keys still in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat, no signs of struggle. It was 3 weeks before her body was found, half buried in the sand near Joshua Tree National Park, her limbs arranged in that now familiar configuration, her face turned upward, her eyes open to the sky. The coroner at the time noted the presence of ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, evidence of prolonged restraint, but no clear cause of death. It was as if she had simply been held in place until her body gave out. Over the next 6 years, 11 more victims followed the same pattern. They were taken from roadsides, parking lots, rest stops, places where people let their guard down for just a moment. All of them were found in remote desert locations, arranged with the same eerie precision, their faces always turned upward, their arms and legs extended at angles that seemed almost ritualistic. There was no sexual component to the crimes, no mutilation beyond the restraint marks, no clear motive that investigators could discern. Crowe did not leave notes. He did not communicate with the press. He did not seek attention. He simply took people, held them, arranged them, and left them for the desert to reclaim. When he was finally identified in 1987, it was largely by accident. A highway patrol officer had stopped him for a broken taillight outside of Barstow and noticed a collection of photographs in the back seat of his vehicle. Polaroids. Dozens of them. Each one showed a different person, bound and silent, their eyes wide with terror, posed in positions that matched the crime scenes investigators had been documenting for years. The officer called for backup. Crowe did not resist. He sat calmly in the driver's seat, his hands on the wheel, and waited. When they searched his vehicle, they found maps marked with locations, lengths of rope, a journal filled with dates and initials, but no names, no explanations, nothing that revealed why he did what he did. He was taken into custody and transported to a holding facility in San Bernardino. He did not speak. He did not answer questions. He simply stared at the walls of his cell with the same empty expression he would later wear on my table. The decision to transfer him to Los Angeles for questioning came 2 days later. The FBI wanted him evaluated by a psychiatric team, and there were facilities in LA better equipped to handle high-profile cases. But Crowe never made it to that evaluation. The morning he was scheduled to be moved, officers found him unresponsive in his cell. He had somehow obtained a bottle of antifreeze and a quantity of barbiturates, though no one could determine how. He had ingested both. By the time paramedics arrived, he was cold, pulseless, and unresponsive. They transported him to the nearest hospital, where he was pronounced dead on arrival. And from there, his body was sent to me. What I did not know then, and what I would only learn in the weeks following the autopsy, was that Nathan Crowe had a history that extended far beyond his criminal record. He had grown up in a small town in eastern Oregon, the son of a mortician. His father ran a family funeral home, a modest operation that served the rural communities scattered across the high desert. Crowe had been raised in that environment, surrounded by the dead from an early age. He had helped his father prepare bodies, learned the techniques of embalming, spent his childhood in rooms that smelled of formaldehyde and roses. According to those who knew him, he had always been quiet, withdrawn, but not in a way that raised concern. He was simply the mortician's son, a boy who kept to himself, who did his work without complaint, who seemed comfortable in the presence of death in a way that most people never are. After his father died in 1978, Crowe sold the funeral home and disappeared. There were no records of where he went or what he did in the years that followed. He resurfaced occasionally, drifting through small towns, taking odd jobs, never staying in one place for long. And then, in 1981, the bodies began to appear. There was no clear connection between Crowe's upbringing and the murders he committed, no obvious psychological through line that would explain why a man trained to care for the dead would choose to create more of them. But there was something in the way he arranged his victims, something almost tender, as if he were preparing them for a ceremony only he understood. It was that detail that haunted the investigators who worked his case. The care, the precision, the suggestion that, to Nathan Crowe, the dead were not objects of horror but something else entirely. Something sacred, perhaps. Or something he believed he could communicate with. I did not think much about Crowe's background in those first hours after the incident. I was too focused on managing the immediate aftermath. After his eyes had closed for the second time, I completed the autopsy as quickly as I could. I examined the heart, the lungs, the liver, the brain. Everything was consistent with the toxicology reports. He had died of poisoning. There was no ambiguity in the physical evidence. His body had shut down. His organs had failed. He was dead. And yet he had opened his eyes. He had spoken. He had known my name, my address, details that no dead man should have been able to access, let alone articulate. I documented the findings in my report, but I left out the incident entirely. I told myself it was because there was no medical basis for including it, no way to record what had happened in language that would make sense to anyone reading the file. But the truth is, I was afraid. Not of Crowe, exactly, but of what it would mean if I acknowledged what I had witnessed. It would mean that something fundamental in my understanding of death was wrong, and I was not ready to accept that. Eric left the coroner's office 2 weeks later. He gave no explanation, simply submitted his resignation and moved back to Northern California. I never spoke to him about what happened, and he never reached out to me. I suspect he wanted to forget. I suspect he believed that by leaving, by putting distance between himself and that morning, he could erase the memory. I do not know if he succeeded. I do not know if he still thinks about Nathan Crowe, or if he has convinced himself that what we saw was some kind of hallucination, a shared delusion brought on by stress or exhaustion. I know that I have never been able to do the same. The memory has stayed with me, vivid and undiminished, for more than 30 years. And in the months that followed the autopsy, as I tried to return to my routine, I began to notice other things. Small things. Details that, on their own, meant nothing, but together formed a pattern I could not ignore. I began to feel watched. It is difficult to describe the sensation without sounding paranoid, but it was unmistakable. A prickling at the back of my neck. A sense of presence in rooms that should have been empty. I would be working late in the autopsy suite, alone, and I would suddenly feel certain that someone was standing just behind me, just out of sight. I would turn, and there would be nothing. Only the steel tables, the white walls, the soft hum of the refrigeration units. But the feeling would not leave. It followed me home. I would wake in the middle of the night, certain that someone was in the house, that I could hear footsteps in the hallway, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of breath. I would search every room, check every lock, and find nothing. My wife, bless her, was patient with me. She suggested I was working too hard, that I needed rest. And perhaps she was right. But rest did not help. The feeling remained. And then, one evening in late November, I received a letter. It arrived in my mailbox at home, addressed to Dr. Marcus Webb in neat, block handwriting. There was no return address. The postmark was smudged, illegible. I opened it standing in my driveway, the envelope cold in my hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. On it, in the same careful handwriting, were 3 words. I see you. Nothing more. No signature. No explanation. Just those 3 words. I stood there for a long time, staring at the paper, feeling the weight of those words settle over me like a shroud. I told myself it was a prank, some tasteless joke. But I knew better. I knew, in the way you know things that cannot be proven but are nonetheless true, that the letter had something to do with Nathan Crowe. I did not know how. I did not know why. But I knew. And I knew, too, that whatever had begun on that October morning in the autopsy suite was not finished. It was only beginning, and I had no idea what it wanted from me or what I would have to do to make it stop. The weeks that followed the arrival of the letter were marked by a growing sense of dislocation. I continued my work at the coroner's office, performing autopsies, filing reports, testifying in court when necessary. To anyone observing me, I must have appeared as I always had, calm, methodical, professional. But beneath that exterior, I was unraveling. I could not stop thinking about Nathan Crowe. I could not stop replaying the moment he had opened his eyes, the sound of his voice, the flat, emotionless way he had spoken my name. I began to research him, digging through old case files, newspaper archives, anything I could find that might offer some insight into who he had been and why he had done what he did. What I discovered did nothing to ease my disquiet. Crowe's childhood, as I mentioned, had been spent in the company of the dead. His father's funeral home was located in a town called Lakeview, a remote settlement near the Oregon-California border, surrounded by high desert and volcanic plains. The town had a population of fewer than 3,000 people, and the funeral home was one of only 2 in the area. Crowe's father, whose name was Arthur, had a reputation as a skilled embalmer, someone who could make even the most damaged bodies presentable for viewing. He was also, by several accounts, a strange man. He kept to himself, rarely spoke to his neighbors, and ran his business with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He insisted that the dead deserve respect, that they should be treated with as much care as the living, perhaps more. He trained his son in those same principles, teaching Nathan the art of embalming from a young age, bringing him into the preparation room to watch, then eventually to assist. One of the few people I was able to track down who had known the Crowe family was a retired schoolteacher named Helen Marsh. She had taught Nathan in the 3rd grade, and she remembered him as a quiet, polite child who rarely spoke unless spoken to. She told me, in a phone conversation I conducted in early December, that Nathan had once brought a dead bird to school for show and tell. He had found it in his backyard, he explained, and his father had helped him preserve it. The bird was displayed in a small wooden box lined with cotton, its feathers smooth and intact, its eyes replaced with tiny black beads. Ellen said the other children had been unsettled by it, but Nathan had seemed proud, even happy, as he explained the process of preservation, the care required to keep the bird from decaying. She remembered thinking, at the time, that it was odd but not necessarily alarming. Children are curious about death, after all. But looking back, she said, there had been something unsettling in the way Nathan spoke about the bird, as if it were still alive in some way, as if death had not truly ended it, only transformed it into something different. Arthur Crowe died in the spring of 1978. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but there were rumors, never substantiated, that he had taken his own life. He was found in the preparation room of the funeral home, slumped over one of the embalming tables, a body half prepared in front of him. Nathan discovered him. He was 24 years old at the time. He called the authorities, arranged for his father's burial, and within 3 months sold the funeral home and left town. No one I spoke to could recall where he went or what he did in the years immediately following his father's death. It was as if he had simply vanished, erased himself from record. And then, 3 years later, Laura Finch disappeared, and the pattern began. The more I learned about Crowe, the more I became convinced that his crimes were not random acts of violence but part of something larger, something he believed he was accomplishing through the arrangement of his victims. The ritualistic positioning of the bodies, the lack of violence beyond restraint, the careful, almost reverent way they were displayed, all of it suggested that Crowe was not simply killing. He was performing. But for whom? And why? I found myself thinking about his father, about the funeral home, about the way Nathan had been raised to see death not as an ending but as a transition, a process that required care and precision. I wondered if, in some twisted way, Crowe believed he was continuing his father's work, not preparing the dead for burial, but preparing them for something else, something he believed came after. It was around this time that I began to experience the dreams. They started in mid-December, just as the city was beginning to decorate for the holidays. I would fall asleep and find myself standing in the autopsy suite. The room was always dim, the overhead lights flickering, casting long shadows across the steel tables. There would be a body on the center table, covered by a white sheet. I would approach it slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I would reach out and pull back the sheet. And every time, it was Nathan Crowe. His eyes would be open, staring up at me, and his mouth would move, forming words I could not hear. I would lean closer, straining to understand, and that is when he would reach up and grab my wrist. His grip was cold and impossibly strong. He would pull me down, his face inches from mine, and he would whisper a single word, "Soon." I would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might tear through my chest. My wife would stir beside me, asking if I was all right, and I would tell her it was just a dream, nothing more. But I knew it was not nothing. The dreams came every night, always the same, always ending with that single word, "Soon." I did not know what it meant. I did not want to know. But I could not escape the feeling that something was coming, that the incident in the autopsy suite had been only the beginning, and that Nathan Crowe, despite being dead, was somehow still present, still watching, still waiting. In January of 1988, I decided to visit Lakeview. I told my wife I needed a few days away, a short trip to clear my head. She did not ask questions, though I could see the concern in her eyes. I drove north, following Highway 395 through the Owens Valley, then cutting east toward the Oregon border. The landscape grew emptier as I climbed, the mountains giving way to high desert, the air thin and cold. Lakeview was exactly as I had imagined it, a small, isolated town clinging to the edge of nowhere, surrounded by sagebrush and juniper, the sky vast and gray. I found the building that had once housed the Crowe family funeral home. It was empty now, the windows boarded up, the paint peeling from the clapboard siding. There was a for sale sign in the front yard, weathered and faded. I stood in front of it for a long time, staring at the darkened windows, trying to imagine what it had been like inside, what Nathan had seen and learned in those rooms. I walked around to the back of the building. The rear entrance was unlocked, the door hanging slightly ajar. I should not have gone inside. I knew that, but I could not stop myself. I pushed the door open and stepped into the dim interior. The smell hit me immediately, mildew, rot, the faint chemical tang of old embalming fluid. The preparation room was at the back of the building, a long, narrow space with a tiled floor and a single steel table in the center. The walls were lined with cabinets, their doors hanging open, their contents long since removed. I walked slowly through the room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. And that is when I saw it. On the far wall, above one of the cabinets, someone had carved words into the plaster. The letters were crude, uneven, as if scratched with a knife or some other sharp object. They read, "They are not gone. They are waiting." I left the building quickly, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I got in my car and drove back to Los Angeles without stopping, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles went white. I did not know who had carved those words, or when, or why, but I knew, with a certainty that felt like ice in my veins, that they had been meant for me. That Nathan Crowe, somehow, and know I would come, and that he had left me a message, a warning, or perhaps an invitation. By the time I returned to Los Angeles, the dreams had intensified. They were no longer confined to sleep. I began to experience them during waking hours, brief flashes of imagery that would intrude on my thoughts without warning. I would be in the middle of an autopsy, making an incision, and suddenly I would see Nathan Crowe's face superimposed over the body in front of me, his eyes open, his lips moving soundlessly. I would blink, and the vision would be gone, but the sensation would linger, a cold, creeping unease that made it difficult to concentrate. My colleagues began to notice. I was distracted, forgetful, slow to respond to questions. One of the senior pathologists pulled me aside and suggested I take some time off, perhaps see a counselor. I thanked him and said I would consider it, but I knew that time off would not help. This was not exhaustion or stress. This was something else. Something that had attached itself to me the moment Nathan Crowe spoke my name. I began to research cases similar to Crowe's, looking for any historical precedent, any record of something like this happening before. I spent my evenings in the medical library, poring over old journals, case studies, anything that might offer an explanation. What I found was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. There were, scattered throughout the history of forensic medicine, accounts of bodies that displayed unusual activity after death. Movements, vocalizations, even instances where the deceased appeared to respond to external stimuli. Most of these cases were dismissed as post-mortem reflex, the result of residual muscle contractions or gas buildup in the tissues. But a few, a very few, defied easy explanation. One case in particular caught my attention. It had occurred in France in the early 19th century, during the height of public anxiety about premature burial. A man named Victor Laurent had been declared dead after ingesting a large quantity of laudanum. His body was prepared for burial, and a wake was held in his family's home. According to the account, written by the attending physician, Laurent's eyes had opened during the viewing. He had sat up in his coffin and spoken a single sentence before collapsing again, this time permanently. The sentence, as recorded, was, "I have seen what waits." The physician noted that Laurent's body showed no signs of life before or after the incident. No pulse, no respiration, no warmth. The event was attributed to a final spasm of the nervous system, though the physician admitted he could not explain how Laurent had formed coherent speech. There were other cases, scattered across different countries and different centuries. A woman in Germany who had been declared dead of cholera, only to sit up during her autopsy and name her killer before expiring again. A child in Scotland who had drowned, whose body was recovered and brought to the local church, and who allegedly spoke to the priest, telling him where to find a missing sibling. These accounts were old, often unreliable, passed down through oral tradition or recorded in journals that no longer existed. But they shared a common thread. The dead, under certain circumstances, could speak. Not for long, not with any clear purpose, but they could speak. And what they said was almost always unsettling. I began to wonder if Nathan Crowe's case was part of this same phenomenon. If there was something about the way he had died, or the way he had lived, that had allowed some fragment of consciousness to persist, if only for a moment. I did not believe in ghosts. I still do not. But I began to entertain the possibility that death was not as absolute as I had been taught. That there was, perhaps, a liminal space, a threshold where the boundary between life and death became permeable, and that certain individuals, for reasons I could not fathom, were able to linger in that space, to reach back across the divide and make contact with the living. The second letter arrived in early February. It was waiting for me when I got home from work, tucked into the mailbox alongside the usual bills and advertisements. The envelope was identical to the first, plain white, no return address, my name written in the same neat, block handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was another single sheet of paper. This time, the message was longer. You felt it when you cut into me. You felt the cold. It is the same cold that waits for you. We all go to the same place, Marcus. Some of us just see it sooner. I saw it. And now you will too. I read the message 3 times, each word sinking deeper into my mind, before I folded the paper and put it back in the envelope. I did not tell my wife. I did not call the police. I knew there was no point. What would I tell them? That a dead man was sending me letters? That I believed, against all reason and logic, that Nathan Crowe was reaching out to me from beyond the grave? They would think I was losing my mind. And perhaps I was. But I could not shake the feeling that the letters were real, that they were coming from somewhere, even if I could not explain how or why. I started to keep a journal. Every night, I would write down everything I remembered about the autopsy, about the dreams, about the letters. I documented the details with the same precision I used in my work, hoping that by putting it all on paper, I might be able to make sense of it. But the act of writing only seemed to deepen my obsession. I found myself thinking about Nathan Crowe constantly, trying to understand what he wanted, why he had chosen me. I considered the possibility that I was simply cracking under the weight of decades spent in the company of the dead, that my mind was creating these experiences as a way of coping with the relentless exposure to mortality. But that explanation felt insufficient. It did not account for the specificity of what I had witnessed, the clarity of Crowe's voice, the accuracy of the information he had spoken. In March, I made the decision to contact an expert in parapsychology. I know how that sounds. I was a man of science, a medical examiner who had spent his entire career rooted in empirical evidence and rational thought. But I was desperate. I needed to talk to someone who might understand what I was experiencing, who would not dismiss it outright as hallucination or delusion. I found a professor at UCLA, a woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, who specialized in near-death experiences and anomalous phenomena. I called her office and explained, in the vaguest terms possible, that I was dealing with a case that had unusual psychological dimensions. She agreed to meet with me. We met in her office on a rainy afternoon. She was younger than I expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a bun and sharp, intelligent eyes. I told her everything. The autopsy. The moment Crowe's eyes opened. The letters. The dreams. She listened without interruption, her expression neutral, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. What you're describing, she said slowly, is not unheard of. There are documented cases of individuals experiencing what we call crisis apparitions, moments of contact with the deceased, often occurring shortly after death. These experiences are usually brief, vivid, and deeply personal. They tend to happen to people who had a close relationship with the deceased. But in your case, you had no prior connection to this man. That makes it unusual. So you believe me? I asked. She hesitated. I believe that you experienced something. Whether it was a genuine contact with Nathan Crowe's consciousness or a psychological projection born from the stress of your work, I can't say. But I do think it's worth exploring. Tell me, Dr. Webb, have you ever experienced anything like this before? I told her I had not. I had spent 42 years performing autopsies, examining thousands of bodies, and I had never seen anything that challenged my understanding of death. Until Nathan Crowe. Dr. Vasquez nodded thoughtfully. There's a theory, she said, that certain individuals, particularly those who die suddenly or violently, or who have unfinished business, can leave behind a kind of psychic residue. An echo. It's not the person, not their soul, but a fragment of their consciousness, imprinted on the environment or on the people they interacted with in their final moments. It's possible that when you open Nathan Crowe's body, You made contact with that residue, and it latched onto you. How do I make it stop? I asked. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. I don't know if you can. Dr. Vasquez's words stayed with me long after I left her office. The idea that I had somehow become a vessel for Nathan Crowe's residual consciousness, that I was carrying a fragment of him with me, was both terrifying and strangely compelling. It suggested that I was not losing my mind, that what I was experiencing had a basis in reality, even if that reality was one I did not fully understand. But it also meant that I was trapped. If Crowe's presence was imprinted on me, then there might be no way to sever the connection. I would have to live with it, endure it, until it ran its course, or until it consumed me entirely. I threw myself into my work with renewed intensity, hoping that by immersing myself in the familiar rhythms of the autopsy suite, I could drown out the intrusive thoughts, the visions, the persistent feeling of being watched. But the work offered no solace. If anything, it made things worse. Every body I examined began to feel like Nathan Crowe. Every face I looked into seemed to carry his features, his pale gray blue eyes, his thin, bloodless lips. I found myself hesitating before making incisions, afraid of what I might see when I opened the body cavity, afraid that the dead would speak to me again, that they would all know my name. The third letter arrived in April. This time, it was not waiting in my mailbox. It was inside my house. I found it on my desk in the study, propped up against the lamp, as if someone had placed it there while I was out. The envelope was the same, but the message inside was different. Longer, more detailed. You think you understand death because you have seen so many bodies, but you have only seen the surface. You have only seen the shell. I lived in that shell, Marcus. I felt it decay around me, felt the cold creep in, the silence settle. But I did not leave. I stayed. I watched. I have been watching you since that morning. I know where you sleep. I know the sound of your wife's breathing. I know the way you check the locks at night, the way you look over your shoulder when you walk to your car. You are afraid. Good. You should be. Because I am still here. And I am getting closer. I sat at my desk, the letter trembling in my hands, and I realized that I had reached a breaking point. This was no longer about understanding what had happened. This was about survival. If Crowe's presence was real, if he was somehow still conscious, still aware, then I needed to find a way to stop him, to banish him, to sever the connection before it destroyed me. I began to research methods of exorcism, protection rituals, anything that might offer a defense against what I was facing. I know how absurd that sounds coming from a man of science, but I was beyond caring about appearances. I needed help, and I was willing to seek it anywhere I could find it. I read about salt circles, protective symbols, prayers from a dozen different religious traditions. I learned about cleansing rituals, about the burning of sage and the use of iron to repel malevolent spirits. I tried several of these methods, performing them alone in my house after my wife had gone to bed, feeling foolish and desperate but unable to stop myself. None of it worked. The dreams continued, the letters continued, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive, until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me every moment of the day. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. I lost weight. My hands developed a tremor that made it difficult to perform precise work. My colleagues grew more concerned, and my supervisor finally insisted that I take a leave of absence. I agreed, not because I thought it would help, but because I no longer trusted myself in the autopsy suite. I was afraid that one day I would make a mistake, that I would cut into a body and find Nathan Crowe staring back at me, not as a vision or a hallucination, but as something real, something that would reach up and pull me down into the cold darkness he kept describing. I spent my leave at home, pacing the rooms of my house, checking the windows and doors obsessively, trying to find some sense of normalcy in the mundane routines of daily life. My wife, bless her patience, did her best to support me, but I could see the strain in her eyes, the worry that I was slipping away from her. And perhaps I was. I felt myself becoming unmoored, disconnected from the world around me, as if I were slowly fading into the same liminal space that Nathan Crowe seemed to inhabit. It was during this time that I received a phone call from Eric, my former assistant. I had not heard from him since he left the coroner's office, and the sound of his voice, shaky and uncertain, sent a chill down my spine. "Dr. Webb," he said, "I need to talk to you about what happened with Crowe." I agreed to meet him at a cafe in Pasadena, a neutral location where we could speak without fear of being overheard. When I arrived, Eric was already there, sitting at a corner table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. He looked older than I remembered, his face drawn and pale, dark circles under his eyes. He looked, I realized, the way I must have looked. "I've been having dreams," he said without preamble. "About him. About that day. He's in every one of them. And he says things. Things he should know." I felt my pulse quicken. "What kind of things?" "He knows where I live," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He knows my wife's name. He knows things I've never told anyone. Private things. And he tells me that I should have stayed, that I shouldn't have run. He says he's waiting for me." I leaned forward. "Have you received any letters?" Eric's eyes widened. "How did you know?" I pulled the most recent letter from my jacket pocket and slid it across the table. He read it, his hand shaking, and when he looked up at me, there was fear in his eyes. Real, undeniable fear. "What is this?" he asked. "What's happening to us?" I told him about my research, about Dr. Vasquez, about the theory that Crowe's consciousness had somehow imprinted itself on us, that we had become conduits for his presence. Eric listened in silence, and when I finished, he sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. "I left because I thought I could escape it," he said quietly. "I thought if I put enough distance between myself and that day, it would stop. But it didn't. It's getting worse. I wake up in the middle of the night, and I can feel him standing next to the bed. I can't see him, but I know he's there. And I think he wants something from us. Something he couldn't finish when he was alive. What could he possibly want?" I asked. Eric opened his eyes and looked at me. "I think he wants us to understand." "Understand what?" "What he saw when he died. What waits for all of us." The conversation with Eric left me more unsettled than ever. The fact that he was experiencing the same phenomena, the same dreams, the same letters, confirmed that this was not simply a product of my imagination. We were both being haunted, if that was the right word, by something connected to Nathan Crowe. But Eric's suggestion that Crowe wanted us to understand something raised a new and deeply troubling question. Understand what? What had Crowe seen in the moments after his death, in the brief window before his consciousness faded? And why did he feel the need to share it with us? I returned home and spent the rest of the evening going through my notes, looking for any detail I might have missed, any clue that could point toward an answer. And that is when I remembered something. In the days following the autopsy, I had received a copy of Crowe's personal effects, a small box containing the items found in his motel room at the time of his arrest. I had glanced through it briefly but had not examined it closely. Now, I retrieved the box from my garage, where it had been stored among other old case files, and carried it into my study. Inside were the usual items: clothing, toiletries, a few personal documents. But at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a plastic evidence bag, was a journal. I had seen it mentioned in the police report, but I had never read it. I opened the bag carefully and removed the journal. It was a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed and brittle. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as the letters, neat, precise, almost mechanical. The entries were dated, beginning in 1979 and continuing until just days before Crowe's death. I began to read. What I found in those pages was both illuminating and horrifying. Crowe had not kept a traditional journal. There were no reflections on his day-to-day life, no musings on his thoughts or feelings. Instead, the journal was filled with observations about his victims. Detailed descriptions of the moments before they died, the expressions on their faces, the way their bodies responded to restraint and isolation. He wrote about them with a clinical detachment that reminded me of my own autopsy reports. But interspersed with these observations were passages that suggested something deeper, something almost philosophical. They do not understand what is happening, he wrote in one entry. They think they are dying, but they are not. They are crossing over. I can see it in their eyes when the light begins to fade. There is a moment, just before the end, when they see it. The place where we all go. The cold, silent place. And they are afraid. But they should not be, because it is waiting for all of us. And it is patient. I read through the entire journal that night, unable to stop, unable to look away. By the time I reached the final entry, written the day before Crowe's death, my hands were shaking. The last entry was different from the others. It was addressed to someone. To me. They will find me soon. I have prepared for this. The poison is ready. I will cross over, and I will see what waits. But I will not go alone. There will be witnesses. The ones who open me, who look inside and think they understand. They will feel it too. The cold, the silence. And they will know that I was right. That death is not an ending. It is a threshold, and I will be waiting on the other side. I closed the journal and sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall, trying to process what I had just read. Nathan Crowe had known. He had known that his body would be brought to a medical examiner. He had known that someone would open him, examine him, try to understand what had happened. And he had used that knowledge to create a trap. Not a physical trap, but a psychological one. A way to reach beyond death, to touch the living, to force them to confront the same questions that had consumed him. And it had worked. The realization that Crowe had orchestrated the entire encounter filled me with a cold, creeping dread. It meant that everything I had experienced, the moment his eyes opened, the sound of his voice, the letters, the dreams, had been intentional. Planned. He had turned his own death into a weapon, a way to infect the living with his obsession, his certainty that death was not an ending but a doorway. And I had walked directly into that trap. I had cut into his body, touched his organs, felt the coldness of his flesh, and in doing so, I had made myself vulnerable to whatever he had left behind. I began to think about the other victims of Nathan Crowe, the 12 people he had taken, restrained, and arranged in the desert. I wondered if they, too, had been part of some larger design, if their deaths had been experiments, attempts to understand the transition from life to death, to map the contours of the threshold Crowe believed existed. I thought about the way he had positioned them, their faces turned upward, their arms and legs extended, as if they were reaching for something, or as if something were reaching for them. Had Crowe been trying to communicate with them, to follow them across the boundary and see what lay beyond? And if so, what had he learned? I decided to visit the locations where the bodies had been found. I needed to see the places where Crowe had performed his rituals, to understand the geography of his obsession. Over the course of several weeks, I drove out into the desert, following the coordinates listed in the police reports, searching for the sites where his victims had been discovered. Most of them were remote, accessible only by dirt roads that wound through rocky canyons and across vast stretches of sand. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, a place where life struggled to take hold, where the sun bleached everything white and the wind erased all traces of human presence. At each site, I found nothing. The bodies had been removed decades ago, the crime scenes long since abandoned. The desert had reclaimed the land, covering the evidence with layers of sand and stone. But there was something about those places, a feeling I could not shake, that made me deeply uneasy. Standing in the empty silence, surrounded by miles of desolation, I felt the same sensation I had experienced in the autopsy suite, the same cold prickling at the back of my neck, the same certainty that I was being watched. I would turn, expecting to see someone behind me, and find only the empty horizon, the distant mountains, the pale sky stretching overhead. But the feeling remained, and I began to understand what Crowe had been searching for in these places. He had been looking for silence, for isolation, for a space where the boundary between life and death was thin enough to see through. I began to have visions during these trips. Brief flashes of imagery that felt less like memories and more like transmissions, as if Crowe were showing me something, guiding me towards some understanding he believed I needed. I would see his victims, not as corpses but as living people, their faces filled with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. I would see Crowe standing over them, calm and expressionless, watching as they struggled against their restraints, waiting for the moment when the light began to fade from their eyes. And then I would see what he saw, a darkness that opened up beneath them, vast and cold and infinite, pulling them down into its depths. It was not a vision of hell. There were no flames, no demons, no torment. It was simply emptiness. A void so complete that it seemed to erase the very concept of existence. These visions left me shaken and disoriented, and I began to question my own sanity. Was I truly seeing these things, or was my mind creating them, filling in the gaps of Crowe's narrative with my own fears and anxieties? I did not know, and the uncertainty was perhaps more frightening than the visions themselves. Because if what I was seeing was real, if Crowe was somehow projecting these images into my mind, then it meant he was still present, still active, still exerting influence over me from beyond the grave. And if it was all in my head, if I was simply breaking down under the weight of decades spent in the company of the dead, then I was losing the one thing I had always relied on, my ability to distinguish reality from delusion. I returned to Dr. Vasquez in late summer. She listened as I described the visions, the trips to the desert, the feeling that Crowe was guiding me towards some revelation I could not yet grasp. She asked me detailed questions about the content of the visions, the emotions I felt during them, the physical sensations that accompanied them. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "Dr. Webb," she said finally, "I think you need to consider the possibility that what you're experiencing is not purely psychological. There is a growing body of research that suggests consciousness may not be entirely confined to the brain. That it may, under certain conditions, exist independently of the body. What you're describing sounds like a phenomenon we call persistent presence, the sense that a deceased individual is still interacting with the living, not through supernatural means, but through some mechanism we don't yet fully understand. It's possible that Nathan Crowe's consciousness, or some fragment of it, has become entangled with yours, and that it's using your perception, your memory, your own psychological framework to communicate. How do I stop it?" I asked. She shook her head. "I don't know if you can, but I do think you need to engage with it, to try to understand what it wants. Because ignoring it, trying to suppress it, is only going to make things worse. What if I don't want to understand?" I said. "What if I just want it to leave me alone?" Dr. Vasquez looked at me with something like pity. "Then I'm afraid you're going to be fighting this for the rest of your life." I left her office feeling more hopeless than ever. The idea of engaging with Crowe's presence, of actively seeking to understand what he wanted, filled me with revulsion. But I also knew she was right. The visions were getting stronger, more frequent, more vivid. The letters continued to arrive, each one more personal, more invasive than the last. If I did not confront this, If I did not find a way to bring it to some kind of resolution, it would consume me, and I would become another victim of Nathan Crowe, not through violence, but through the slow erosion of my sanity. That night, alone in my study, I made a decision. I would return to the place where it had all begun. I would go back to the autopsy suite, to the table where Nathan Crowe had opened his eyes and spoken my name. I did not know what I hoped to find there, or what I expected to happen, but I knew that if there was any chance of ending this, of severing the connection, it would have to happen in the place where the connection was first made. I returned to the Los Angeles County Coroner's office late one evening after the day shift had ended and the building was mostly empty. I let myself in using my old key, which still worked, and made my way down the familiar hallways to the autopsy suite. The room was dark, the overhead lights off, the steel tables gleaming faintly in the dim glow from the hallway. I flipped on the lights and stood in the center of the room, looking around at the space where I had spent so many years, where I had examined so many bodies, where I had learned to see death as a process rather than an event. I approached the table where Crowe had lain. I placed my hands on the cold steel surface and closed my eyes. I tried to clear my mind, to open myself to whatever was there, to whatever Crowe wanted me to see. For a long time, there was nothing. Just the hum of the ventilation system, the distant sound of traffic outside, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. And then, slowly, I began to feel it. The cold. The same cold I had felt when I first touched Crowe's body. It spread through my hands, up my arms, into my chest, until my entire body was filled with it. And in that cold, I heard his voice. Not spoken aloud, not a sound in the air, but a voice in my mind, clear and distinct, as if he were standing beside me, whispering directly into my ear. You feel it now, don't you, Marcus? The cold, the silence. It is always there, waiting beneath the surface. You spend your life cutting into bodies, trying to understand death, but you never truly understood, because you were afraid to cross the threshold yourself. I was not afraid. I crossed over willingly, and now I am showing you what I found. I opened my eyes and found myself standing in a different place. Not the autopsy suite. Not anywhere I recognized. I was in a vast, empty space, a landscape of gray sand and gray sky, stretching in all directions as far as I could see. There was no sun, no horizon, no markers to orient myself by. Just the sand, the sky, and the overwhelming silence. And in the distance, a figure, walking toward me, slowly, deliberately. I knew, even before I could make out the details, that it was Nathan Crowe. He stopped a few feet away from me, his pale eyes fixed on mine. He looked exactly as he had in life, except there was something different about him, something I could not quite define. He seemed less solid, less real, as if he were a projection or a shadow rather than a physical being. When he spoke, his voice was the same flat, emotionless tone I remembered from the autopsy suite. This is where we all come, Marcus. Eventually, there is no heaven, no hell, just this. The silence, the cold, and the waiting. I wanted you to see it, to understand, because you will be here too one day. And when you are, I will be waiting for you. I tried to speak, to ask him what he wanted, why he had done this to me, but no sound came out. My voice was gone. I could only stand there, frozen, as Crowe turned and walked away, disappearing into the gray distance. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vision ended. I was back in the autopsy suite, my hands still resting on the steel table, my body shaking with cold. I stumbled backward, gasping for breath, and collapsed into a chair against the wall. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. Was it a hallucination? A product of stress and exhaustion? Or had I truly crossed over, if only for a moment, into the place Nathan Crowe had described? I did not know, and I realized, with a sinking certainty, that I might never know, because the answer to that question lay beyond the reach of science, beyond the reach of reason. It existed in a realm I had spent my entire life trying to avoid, a realm where the dead do not stay silent, and the boundaries between worlds are not as solid as we would like to believe. The vision in the autopsy suite marked a turning point. After that night, the letters stopped. The dreams stopped. The feeling of being watched gradually faded, replaced by a different kind of awareness, a quiet certainty that Nathan Crowe was no longer reaching out to me because he had already accomplished what he set out to do. He had shown me what he wanted me to see. He had pulled me, however briefly, into the cold, silent place he believed awaited all of us. And now, having delivered his message, he had withdrawn, leaving me to carry the weight of that knowledge alone. I returned to work a few weeks later, resuming my duties at the coroner's office with a sense of profound disconnection. I performed autopsies, filed reports, testified in court, but the work no longer held the same meaning it once had. Every body I examined felt like a reminder of Crowe's message, a confirmation that death was not an ending but a passage into something vast and indifferent. I began to see my work not as a search for truth but as a denial of it, an attempt to impose order and understanding on a process that resisted both. I felt like a man standing at the edge of an abyss, pretending not to see the darkness below. My colleagues noticed the change in me. I was quieter, more withdrawn, less engaged with the daily rhythms of the office. My supervisor asked if I was still struggling with whatever had prompted my leave of absence. I told him I was fine, that I just needed time to readjust. He accepted the explanation, though I could see the doubt in his eyes. The truth was, I was not fine. I was profoundly changed, marked by an experience I could not share, could not explain, and could not forget. Eric called me again in the fall. He told me the dreams had stopped for him as well, that he no longer felt Crowe's presence, but that he was left with the same lingering unease, the same sense that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the world. We met for coffee a few more times over the following months, two men bound together by a shared trauma, trying to make sense of what had happened to us. But we never found satisfying answers. We could only acknowledge the experience, accept that it had changed us, and try to move forward. I continued to work as a medical examiner for another 27 years, retiring in 2015 at the age of 67. In all those years, I never experienced anything like what happened with Nathan Crowe. I examined thousands of bodies, handled countless difficult cases, but none of them spoke to me, none of them opened their eyes, none of them reached across the boundary between life and death. Crowe was unique. Whether that was because of who he was, what he believed, or simply because of the specific circumstances of his death, I will never know. After I retired, I tried to put the experience behind me. I spent time with my wife, traveled, enjoyed the quiet pleasures of a life no longer defined by death and decay. But I could never fully escape the memory of that October morning, the sound of Crowe's voice, the vision of that gray, silent place. It lingered in the back of my mind, a shadow that refused to dissipate, a reminder that there are things in this world, and perhaps beyond it, that we will never fully understand. I have shared this story with very few people. Most would not believe it. They would dismiss it as a delusion, a stress-induced hallucination, the product of a mind pushed too far by decades of exposure to trauma and death. And perhaps they would be right. Perhaps I did imagine the entire thing. Perhaps Nathan Crowe never opened his eyes, never spoke my name, never showed me the cold, silent place he believed awaited us all. But I do not think so. I believe, with a certainty that has only deepened with time, that what I experienced was real. That Nathan Crowe, in his final act, found a way to reach beyond death, to touch the living, to share the terrible knowledge he had gained. And I believe that knowledge has stayed with me, shaping my thoughts, my dreams, my understanding of what it means to die. I am an old man now, approaching the end of my own life. My health is declining, my body failing in the slow, inexorable way that all bodies eventually fail. I think about death often, more than I did even during my years as a medical examiner. And when I do, I think about Nathan Crowe. I think about the gray desert, the empty sky, the silence that stretches on forever. I wonder if he was right, if that is truly what waits for us. And I wonder, with a mixture of dread and curiosity, if he will be there when I arrive, standing in the distance, watching, waiting, just as he promised he would be. I do not know what will happen when I die. None of us do. But I know this. The boundary between life and death is thinner than we like to believe. And there are those who, through obsession or will or some quality we cannot define, are able to cross that boundary, to exist in both worlds at once, to reach back and touch the living with cold, insistent hands. Nathan Crowe was one of those people. He found a way to persist beyond death, to make his presence felt, to force others to confront the questions that had consumed him. And in doing so, he left a mark on me that will never fade. I tell this story not to frighten or unsettle, though I know it may do both. I tell it because it is true as anything I have ever experienced, and because I believe it deserves to be remembered. Nathan Crowe was a killer, a man who took 12 lives and arranged them in the desert like offerings to some incomprehensible god. But he was also something else. A seeker, a believer, a man who looked into the face of death and refused to accept that it was the end. And whether his beliefs were justified, whether the place he showed me is real or simply a projection of his own fears and obsessions, I cannot say. But I know that he believed it. And I know that, for a brief, terrible moment, he made me believe it too. So I will end with this. If you are listening to this story late at night, in the quiet hours when the world feels thin and strange, and you find yourself wondering what lies beyond the edge of life, what waits in the darkness we all must eventually enter, I want you to remember Nathan Crowe. Remember the gray desert, the empty sky, the cold silence. And know that, whatever comes after, there may be those who have gone before, who linger in that in-between place, watching, waiting, ready to reach out and touch the living one last time. Whether that thought brings you comfort or terror is up to you. But do not dismiss it. Do not assume that death is the final word, the end of all stories. Because in my experience, it is not. It is only the beginning of a different kind of story. One that is told in whispers and shadows, in the cold touch of a corpse's hand, in the voice of a dead man speaking your name in the stillness of an empty room. And if, one day, you find yourself standing over a body, preparing to cut into flesh that should be silent and still, and you see the eyes open, and you hear a voice that should not exist, do not assume you are imagining it. Do not assume you are losing your mind, because you might be the next witness. The next person Nathan Crowe, or someone like him, has chosen to carry his message forward. And when that happens, you will understand what I have come to understand. That the dead do not always stay dead. That some voices refuse to be silenced. And that the boundary between this world and whatever lies beyond is far more permeable than any of us would like to believe. I have carried this knowledge for more than 3 decades. And now, in sharing it with you, I pass a portion of that burden along. Whether you accept it or reject it, whether you believe me or dismiss me as a man whose mind has been warped by too many years in the company of corpses, is your decision. But remember this, Nathan Crowe knew my name. He knew where I lived. He knew things no dead man should have been able to know. And if he could reach across that boundary once, he can do it again. To me, to you, to anyone who stands too close to the edge and looks too long into the darkness. So be careful, be vigilant, and if you ever find yourself in the presence of the dead, in that quiet moment when you are alone with a body, with nothing but the sound of your own breathing and the cold stillness of the air, remember that you are not necessarily alone. That there may be something there with you, something that sees you, knows you, waits for you. And when your time comes, when you cross that final threshold and step into the gray desert, into the cold silence, you may find that Nathan Crowe was telling the truth all along. That he is still there, still waiting, and that he will greet you as an old friend, as someone who finally understands what he tried so hard to show the living. That death is not the end. It is only the beginning of a very long, very cold wait.